Hello, global gardeners. Can you believe it? It's Monday already again. I don't know what happened with this last week. The weather here was pretty terrible, but I managed to stay pretty busy doing some gardening stuff. Whenever the sun would come out and would warm a little bit, I was outside. And this next week is going to be fantastic. I know there's a lot of areas, particularly in the US, that are getting a lot of rain right now. I hope that eases a little bit and you can get out in the garden. But for all of us, the garden just has that draw. We just want to get out there at every opportunity. And we all have some similarities as well. The problems in the garden. Some of those problems, whether we're gardening in Australia or Norway or Scotland or Canada or the US, they're similar problems. There's the pest problem. There's watering issues that we all seem to have. There's the question about fertilizer, the plant selection. All of these different things at some point or another can be seen as a problem that we have on our gardening journey. But what about the bigger issues, the challenges that we have in the garden? And I look at those as two different things. We have problems. Weeding is a problem. We get weeds in our garden. But when we stay on top of it, when we see a weed and pull it, it's rarely a challenge because it's just a minor problem and we deal with it. If you don't keep up with the weeds and they begin to take over, then it becomes a challenge. And so, as we proceed with the discussion today, let's talk about some of the problems you have in your garden and some of the challenges you have in your garden. I'll share some of my thoughts and some of the things that I have to deal with on a regular basis. And together, let's try to come up with some solutions or some ways to approach some of these issues. I look at my garden and I think it looks pretty good. It works out pretty well. I enjoy what I'm doing. And luckily, I only have a few challenges. Now, one of my biggest is soil. Here in Colorado, my soil is terrible. I can't grow in it. I've tried. The soil has no nutrient value to speak of. I've done the soil test. It has no organic matter, less than 1%. And so the only plants that can grow in that soil are the native plants, and the weeds that blow in and try to take over because they do well in poor soil. So it's not a problem for me, it is a challenge for me. And I can approach it a couple different ways. I can approach it as a major challenge, a battle against nature and my soil by amending, by using fertilizers, by lots and lots of work. Or I can take a different approach. And that's why I use so many raised beds is I find it easier for me to build a raised bed and fill it with good soil from the beginning so that I don't have that battle. I just go ahead and start gardening as soon as the bed is built and filled, and then I work on improving the soil past that point. So I can do battle, and often when we are battling some of these major issues, it's a no-win situation. Or we can find alternatives, and those alternatives might be easier, they might be cheaper, they might be more expensive, but if the alternative ends up being a solution, then suddenly it is less of a problem. And it certainly doesn't rise to the challenge level that we may have had before. Shandy's Garden, hello to you, says, oh, yes, I'm currently searching for my forever homestead, but my classroom garden is a hot mess express. I loved on it pretty hard. That's great. I love that. The many gardens I've had over the years have all been stepping stones to get to the next garden. It's that hot mess express of a garden where maybe you do have those issues with the weeds or you have the issues with the soil and you learn from them so that when you move to the next forever garden, you've got it figured out, at least more figured out than maybe you have today. So, Tony, nice to see you here. Simplified Gardening says still beautiful here today, which means more wildfires for me when I get to work. I hope it lessens for you, mate. It is not enjoyable when good weather equates to more work. So I'm sorry to hear that. Greg is saying my biggest challenges are squash bugs and cucumber beetles. Nothing else comes close. So there you go. So that's a great one. The pest issues that many of us have tend to be our biggest challenges. And the individual pests will vary. So whether it's rabbits or deer or squash bugs or cucumber beetles, it typically finds its way into our garden, whatever that pest happens to be. And if it likes what it finds, it's going to stay. And so when we approach this again as a major battle, I think that is one of the ways that you can overcome some of those issues. So let's talk about pests for a little bit. And the specific pests will vary from region to region. And I think, and I've said this many times before, one of the most important things you can do when you're dealing with a pest is to identify the pest. Too many people think, oh, I have aphids, or I have squash bugs, or I have fill in the blank. And maybe that isn't what you have. Now, the bigger ones, sure, the squash bugs and the cucumber beetles are often pretty easy to identify. But if you just see damage to your leaves, or if you see holes in your fruit, you may assume it's one kind of pest when maybe it's completely different. When you can identify the specific pest, now you can bring some of those tools, some of those weapons in your arsenal to help win the battle. The integrated pest management concept, I'm a huge believer in, and identification is a big part of that. Trying to figure out which method you're going to use to confront those pests actually gives you quite a wide range. One of the things I like to do, particularly when I've identified the pest, is to learn more about it, to do some research and find out when that pest is most vulnerable to attack. There are a lot of these insect pests in particular in our garden that aren't affected by pesticides at certain points in their life. There are other points in their life where maybe a pesticide will be effective. And so the common response for many gardeners is to grab that pesticide, spray their plants in an attempt to kill the pest. And maybe the pest is the only thing that can survive that pesticide attack. All the beneficial insects, all the benign insects are killed by the pesticide, and all that's left is that pest. And now it's wide open. It's got a smorgasbord ahead, and it can feed whenever it wants. So identifying those key points in the life of that pest where you can attack it effectively is really a good approach. And as you look at the life cycle, and that also provides other opportunities. So for instance, if it is a pest where an adult overwinters, for example, in a pile of leaves or a pile of brush, and then it emerges and it lays eggs on the young plant, and then it's the larva that devours the plant. That happens with a lot of these insect pests that we have. Well, if you can just keep the adult away from the plant, you've eradicated that insect pest. It can't get to your plant to lay the eggs. And so it's going to either die off or go someplace else. This is where the covers over our beds with an insect fabric of some type is so effective. Just a little bit of netting, that fine mesh netting, is often enough to deter the pest. So those are a couple ideas. Of course, we could talk for a whole show on the insect pests. But that's how I like to approach all of these different challenges, is trying to break them down to the smaller components within that challenge. And by attacking those individual pieces, you may be able to topple the whole thing as a challenge. And then it just becomes a periodic problem that you now know how to deal with. So consider that as we proceed with our discussion today. And we'll see how it works out for all of us. Brett is asking, wondering if a 10-gallon fabric pot would be big enough to grow horseradish in, or should I go bigger? So I would actually change it. So fabric pots can last a long time, but eventually they will break down. Horseradish is a perennial plant that can live for decades. So I would suggest, if you want to grow it in a container, grow it in a hard-sided container that would last longer than a fabric pot. Now, 10 gallons should be more than enough. If you are planning on growing it and then harvesting it all at once, then sure, a fabric pot would work great. But if you're planning on keeping it as a plant and just harvesting little bits of it periodically, that's what I do. I've got my horseradish growing in my metal trough beds, because horseradish can escape quite easily. I found this out the hard way when I was first growing horseradish 20 years ago in a low raised bed, and it escaped from underneath and began taking over the garden. So a container that can keep it from spreading is definitely a good idea. 10-gallon fabric, yes, that'll work. But if you're looking to the long term to have a plant that you can harvest for years to come, I would consider something maybe a little bit bigger and something that has hard sides that the plant can't escape from. My trough is the equivalent of about 40 gallons, I think. Now half of that is how deep it is. So the actual area that the horseradish plant is growing in is probably closer to 10 gallons, and the plant loves it. It does extremely well. The size that you're talking about is definitely suitable, but look to the long term and how big you want the plant to be before you start harvesting it. And that may help you out a little bit. Gina's saying, I suddenly have big issues with rodents, mostly rats and squirrels. We are catless for the first time in years, hoping to get kittens in a few weeks. The kittens should help. But yes, this is another one of those problems that so many of us have when we talk about the pests and rodents. The reason you probably have a rodent problem is because they have food. Now, I had a rodent problem in my garden. My garden is usually relatively pest-free most of the time, but a few years ago in my big enclosed garden area, Mala was still young, and she would get out and she would jump in the beds, and I didn't want her jumping in those beds. They were my tomato beds, and she liked eating tomatoes. So I put a gate in that area. As soon as I put a gate in that area, that enclosed area was now protected. I've got hawks in my area. I've got owls in my area. I've got feral cats in my area. And I never had a rodent problem until I fenced off that part of my garden. And the mice moved in because there were no predators. And there were lots of tomatoes on the plants and lots of tomatoes on the ground. And the mice had a field day. So I had to eliminate that possibility. I opened up the gate to allow Mala to come back in. I did a little bit of trapping to try to at least reduce the number of the mice that I had, and I was able to get the situation under control. So try to identify what it is that's causing the issue. Are they focused on one particular area of your garden? Are they being attracted by a food source? Are they being attracted by a home source? So I know I have mice near my compost pile because it's also protected and it's warmer, particularly in our winter months. Mala knows that, and Alika knows that. And so they periodically, over a course of days, will bring me baby mice. And I have no doubt that those baby mice are coming from a nest near my compost pile. So my dogs take care of it. Kittens growing into cats will definitely take care of it. But if you can, again, break it down into some of the individual components and try to find out where they're coming in and what they're feeding on, then you can direct your efforts toward those issues. Take away their food source, take away their protection, or even try to attract some of those predators to your garden until the cats become big enough that they can deal with the issue. Big Wheel Dogs saying, while enlisted, were you able to have a garden or involved in having one where you were? So when I was in the Air Force, I did have a garden in Montana. That was actually the first garden that I really had uh, over 35 years ago. Terrible region to grow in, extremely cold, bad soil. I didn't know anything, but I had a garden. Then when I moved to California, also in the Air Force, yes, I did have a garden, much easier to grow there. And that's really, I think, when I got the bug to continue gardening because it was so easy. And then we moved to Oklahoma, and I had a garden in Oklahoma. But the challenge in Oklahoma was the pests and the soil and the lack of knowledge. So I like to add knowledge when we talk about the challenges. And that's why I suggest breaking it down individual pieces, because it's the lack of information, our own lack of knowledge, that really can start with a small problem and make it into something far worse than that. So that's where I did my preliminary gardening. And then when I moved here to Colorado, I had my first real major garden, like spending weeks building the garden and learning things like you can't grow the horseradish in an open bed. And then after a few years, I became a master gardener and learned even more while I was at that house in that garden. So, uh, wherever I live from here on out, I'll have a garden. And I think a lot of us kind of fall into that category. Once it gets you hooked, you've always got to have a garden from that point forward. It was more challenging in the Air Force, of course, having to be gone often and long hours, uh, but it's doable. And so when when I hear people say that their challenge is that they don't have enough time in their garden, yes, that is a major challenge, but it can be done. I look at people like Tony O'Neill from Simplified Gardening, a firefighter on a busy job for many hours, days at a time. And then he comes home. He has to spend time with his family, doesn't have to, wants to spend time with his family. Oh, and then by the way, has a YouTube channel and makes videos and has a major section of, of plots growing his garden. I don't know when the man sleeps, but he's a perfect example to show that if your challenge is time, you can overcome that challenge by just breaking it down into the individual pieces, the tasks that need to be accomplished. Maybe it involves more planning. Definitely, it involves more education so that you're not working harder, you're working smarter. But I kind of learned that through my time in the Air Force, bouncing around trying to have a garden, that it can be done if you just take it one small step at a time. Blue Veil Meadows ALDs says, my biggest challenge pest, the dogs. Going to have to do better fencing around the raised beds this year. That's so true. I made a comment to Gary at the Rusted Gardener because he just showed a video recently of him building fence around his garden because of his dogs. And the comment I made was, I'm doing the same project this year. And in fact, yesterday, I spent a lot of time outside measuring, staking, and planning the fence I'm going to build around my garden. So right now for me, it is a bit of a challenge. Lika loves it outside. She spends all day outside. While I like being outside, I don't spend all day outside. She, in particular, having that puppy energy, will jump into the beds. There's nothing growing in them right now, but she will dig a nice little spot and make a bed. And I can't always be out there to correct her. So I'm going to build a fence around my garden because, yes, my dogs are also pests right now. And it is a challenge. If I don't do anything about it, it can become worse. Last year, I had an issue in one of my beds and I put my hoop over it, my cattle panel hoop, and that didn't stop Lika at all. She just jumped through one end and would run through to the other end and trample the plants along the way. So I had to put up not only my hoops, the nice sturdy cattle panel hoops that I have, but I had to put chicken wire on the ends of the hoops to keep Lika from running through the beds. And of course, she's just running and playing and doesn't know that there's actually plants there that she shouldn't trample. We're working on it. When I'm out there, they're great. They don't jump in the beds. There's no issue at all. And so I can't really take corrective action because they're doing things right when I'm there. It's when I'm not there that's the challenge. And that's why, like you, I'm going to have to put up a fence around my garden. You'll see it in a video, of course, and I'm trying to balance the cost versus the materials versus how good it looks. I want everything to be as beautiful as possible without costing an arm and a leg. So that's coming soon. But yeah, even your friends, even your family pets can be a challenge. And the first solution is training, and that worked pretty well with Mala. But when Mala and Lika get together and they're running and chasing and playing, Mala will jump in the beds chasing Lika and vice versa, where she never did that before by herself. So that one little piece works, but it doesn't solve the greater challenge. And being out there all the time works, but that also doesn't solve it. A fence around the garden should solve that particular issue for me and for others who have dogs in the garden. I did that that garden I had 25 years ago, that first one that I was really devoting attention to. And my beloved dog at the time was out there with me in the garden every day. She would lie down and watch me work. She was such a wonderful dog. But she would run through the beds chasing the squirrels. She loved to chase squirrels. I had to put a fence up. That was the first time I ever fenced a garden for an animal. And I've done it 3 times since then. So just be aware that sometimes the challenge is literally staring you in the face at supper time and all the other times that you are looking at your dogs. So something to think about. Jay says, we love to read all the thoughtful gardening challenges that are being listed. Absolutely. So I'll try to cover as many as I can, and we'll continue to go from there. But yeah, I'm interested in seeing what they are too. Sunset Gazing says, my challenge is stopping. Stop adding more beds, more plants. Just stop adding more. This year will be the year of no more. Like 24 was no more seed buying. Well, after I extend to, okay. Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, I mentioned this a while back that I have not bought seeds this year because I had to make that same decision. That was a challenge for me. That was definitely a challenge, like it's a challenge for you. I love buying new seeds. I love it. And it was a challenge to stop that addiction. And it's great. All of my tomatoes and peppers that have been started and are growing downstairs are ones that I've grown before from seed packets, some of them years old, and they're still fine. So, yeah, our individual challenges may not seem like much until it reaches that point that it's no longer just a little problem. It is something that you do need to confront. Jason Bruno, hello. First time on your live. My biggest challenge, at least last year, was mice. They were pulling whole bean plants out of the ground and ran off with them. So, welcome, first off, Jason. Glad to have you here today. When we deal with the pests, kind of like I talked about the insect, the adult insect that needs to fly to the plant to lay the eggs, it also works the same way with some of these pests. So I currently have my strawberry plants in my raised beds, and the raised beds do a great job deterring the rabbits that I have and the voles that I have and the mice for the most part. But when they do find the bed, a barrier is really the best option. And so all of my raised beds have metal mesh barriers at the bottom, at the base, so that the gophers and the voles can't dig in from underneath. For things like the mice, and at the last house when I had strawberry beds that were in open ground, they weren't in raised beds, this is what I had to do. I had to put the hoops over those strawberry beds and then cover that whole area with mesh fabric to keep the mice out and to keep the rabbits out. I had rabbits at that garden as well. And so when you have an issue like that where something is getting to the plants, especially when they're ripping the plants out, you need a barrier. You need something around those plants so they just can't get to it. Yes, it's extra work, it's extra expense, but that really is going to be probably the best way to deal with some of those issues is just keep those pests away. Just make it so they can't get to the plants in the first place. And now all of a sudden, it's not a problem and it's no longer a challenge. Dennis is saying, I'm going to try solarizing one of my beds to get rid of the Bermuda grass. They come in via rhizomes, which just gets worse when pulling. Yeah, any of the grasses like that, the weeds like that, that spread through rhizomes can be extremely difficult to get rid of. And solarization is a great option. So what that is you put a big sheet of plastic around the area that you're trying to kill everything in that area. You weigh down all the edges because you don't want the water coming in. You really want the whole area to be secluded. And what the plastic does is it acts like a greenhouse. So the sun shines through the plastic, hence solarization, and it heats up the soil, it heats up the plants. And essentially, because there's no water coming in, there's no nutrients coming in, you're cutting off as much oxygen as you can as well because you've got it all weighted down. And the plants will end up dying. It takes months to accomplish that. But I agree with you, Dennis, that is a great approach because it is effective. Over time, the sun shining through that plastic, the heat, the lack of nutrients and water, that's enough to kill even Bermuda grass. And so if you've got, I recommend this, for instance, if someone asks me about poison ivy, a lot of those plants that are very difficult to eradicate, if you use solarization, it might be the solution to a very difficult plant problem that you're trying to get rid of. So this gets back to the idea of education and developing the knowledge of what works if you have a particular challenge. And that helps decide how you're going to approach it from that point. Bowtie Life is asking, I have 4 passion fruit vines coming. I'm considering mostly burying a few 25 to 40 gallon hard pots to plant them in for control. Will that be enough for them? Any pitfalls? So it should be. I know you live in a more moist environment than I do, depending on what kind of hard pots you're talking about. So if you're talking about ceramic pots or terracotta pots, the biggest issue when growing in big pots like that, if you live in an area that gets wet, is what freezing you might encounter. And so the possibility that some of those plants might crack. Now, when you bury them, that does tend to moderate the temperatures a little bit more. You might not have the extremes that would cause the cracking, but that would be one of those concerns. The other concern I would have is depending on how big the plant gets. So the passion fruit in the first couple years, by all means, 25 to 40 gallons should be enough. But they can get quite big and grow for a very long time. So I would look 5 years down the road and see if this is how you want to be growing them 5 years from now. And then also step back a little bit and say, what is really the control issue? Are you concerned about them spreading? And if that's the case, then yes, putting them into a hard container is going to be more effective. If it's something where you don't feel that you have the knowledge or the experience or the time to deal with them, then yeah, that makes total sense. But again, looking 5 years down the road where maybe you've got more availability and you can get out and have them growing in open ground. And a lot of people do have them growing in open ground, and that might enable you to stay on top of it. So maybe a tiered approach where you grow them in containers now, learn how to do it, keep them controlled, and then maybe consider growing them outside those containers in the future so that they have better access to the soil. Because that's one of those issues when we talk about growing in containers or pots that we don't have when we're growing in ground or in larger raised beds is the soil. In the larger beds, the soil tends to recuperate itself. All of the insects rolling through, the addition of compost, the soil tends to stay good once you've developed the soil. When you're growing in containers, you need to do more work to fertilize, to add organic matter, to maintain the levels within the pot. So take that under consideration as well, that container growing is different as far as the nutrients and the support for the plant is concerned. And that's kind of why I suggest if you can get them out of pots in the future, that will be better for the plant in the long run because they'll have exposure to all of the soil. So a couple thoughts, and you may have already thought about those. So definitely think about it. Rick has a solution. Talk about rats and mice. They eat the compost worms. If you don't want worms in your compost, have the rats and the mice. If you like the worms, and I've got worms in my cool compost piles, then yes, you've got to deal with the rats and the mice. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that as a reason that I have the vermin in my piles. I just had assumed that they were coming to eat the food scraps. But once things start decomposing and cooling, the worms are going to move in, and that is another food source. So interesting to add that to our bag of tricks as well. Silly Lily says, bags of seed, lawn seed in the shed, garage, will bring them in. You need to seal any seeds in tight lid bins. Absolutely. And this gets back to why are they coming in? There's a food source. I have this issue right now. Well, I corrected the issue. I had this issue up until now in my garage and in my shed where I stored my birdseed. And I would come out and I would find holes in the bags of birdseed and eaten kernels spread around because the mice would come in and eat my bags. And I had to do exactly the same thing. Once I put my birdseed in sealed containers, I took away the food and actually put out, like in my shed, for instance, where I had the birdseed, and I think the mice were eating more of the birdseed than I was giving to the birds. So once I put it into a container and I put some mouse traps in my shed, I never caught a mouse because once the food source was gone, the mice left. So I still have a trap. I've had that trap in my shed for months now and have never caught a mouse because I don't have mice in my shed anymore. So yeah, that's a great suggestion to deal with the rodent issue. If you can track it down to something like seeds, put them in a sealed container and trouble may disappear. Shandy's Garden says, my biggest issue is mud. making it impossible to walk, either lots of wood mulch or fabric. I'm leaving huge marks. I need to work. I'm thinking 2 pieces of plywood to move through. Thoughts. Okay, so I don't have a mud issue to speak of, except periodically when we get the deluge from thunderstorms. And that's a big reason why I use wood chip mulch and the chunky wood chip mulch, so that in my pathways, I don't have to deal with mud. And my biggest issue right now is we've had lots of snow and melt and snow and melt. And so my floor on a daily basis is just covered with little muddy paw prints. And I haven't gotten to that area outside my house to cover a pathway and keep the mud from coming into the house. But that's my first attack at this particular problem, and it's a challenge. It is, how do I cover the soil so that it doesn't become muddy? And a mulch is an issue. Now, whether it's a gravel mulch or a wood chip mulch, the idea is to cover it. And so plywood, yeah, absolutely. Same basic idea. Covering the soil so that you can walk on it without getting your feet muddy and without making the mud problem worse. The fabric, I have mixed feelings on that. If you put a weed fabric down, it might work initially, but it probably isn't a long-term solution by itself. If you use a fabric with a mulch, then yes, that can definitely cover a pathway and cut down on the mud issue. The the approach I'm taking in some other areas of my garden, or I should say between my garden and the house, in creating a path, is to use stone stepping stones along with the wood chips and the gravel, and trying to make the pathway a little more decorative. And so you'll be seeing, of course, videos on that as that happens more and more. But uh, whatever the solution is, I think you're on the right track, having something to put out there. Plywood will break down when it gets wet, and it's not necessarily a long-term fix. If you can think of a long-term approach with a pathway, then that may make the whole thing easier and look good in the process. So consider that as an option. Serena says, do Colorado and Oklahoma have any of the same native plants, or are they all different? It depends. It depends on the plant. And so the northwest corner of Oklahoma is very close to the southeast corner of Colorado. And so, yes, that region will have some native plants that are similar. But both states are so huge that if you moved in opposite directions, so if you go to eastern Oklahoma and try to compare that with western Colorado, completely different plants. And you go up into the mountains, the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, or go down into the river banks in Oklahoma, completely different plants. So there are some similarities in regions that have similar climates, but for the most part, they're all going to be different. And that holds true with pretty much every state in the US and countries around the world. Everybody has their own native plants. And so learning about your native plants that are suitable for your area will really make a difference. Now, that being said, I love going to the San Diego Botanic Gardens, and I did that in December. I've done it different. I think I've done it all 4 months of the year. Three of the 4 months of the year, I've gone to San Diego to go through the Botanic Gardens, and they have an African area that is incredible. They're growing lots of South African plants in particular, because the climate in San Diego, California is very similar to the climate in South Africa. So while we might have these different native plants in different regions, you might find a region somewhere across the globe that is similar to yours, and you might be able to grow what is a native plant for them and it will do well in your garden. So the key difference is how we identify what a native plant is and how we define it, because there are many of us that are growing plants that do as well as native plants, but they're not native to our area. They are an import that is brought in because they can actually do well in our particular environment. So, for the most part, all of us will have different native plants than others. Russell's saying good morning, and good morning to you. Started butterfly weed seeds this week in my zone 2 to 3. Awesome. Yeah, butterfly weed is a wonderful plant to grow. I was just reading uh, an article this weekend about the huge drop in the monarch population over the last year. And there are a number of milkweed plants that are sold as butterfly weed. And I grow them in my Zone 5 garden with the possibility. I haven't seen a monarch butterfly in decades, but my garden has the milkweed plants, which is a food source for the monarch butterfly. So if their numbers ever get big enough and they ever happen to fly across Colorado again and they're looking for a food source, I have it in my garden. So I strongly encourage growing things like butterfly weed and all the different types of milkweed plants that could be food for something like a monarch butterfly. And they tend to be hardy. Mine come back every year in Zone 5. I'm assuming that you checked for the ones that you have that are going to be perennial in Zone 2 and 3, and thumbs up to you, Russell. I think that's awesome. Bohemian Herbology says, I agree with the smarter, not harder. If expectations on regards to what a garden should look like are geared more towards the natural law, it's much easier. Yeah, this gets back to what I was just talking about with the native plants. If you try to grow something that just doesn't want to grow in your garden, then you are definitely working harder. And you might be able to find an alternative that can grow in your garden by doing that little bit of research and that little bit of education. It makes it so much easier when you grow plants that are happy in your garden and that you're not battling the weather, the soil, and everything else that you have in your garden. So, yeah, thank you for saying that. I've always tried to work smarter than harder. I'm a relatively lazy gardener. I do a lot of work in my garden setting it up, but once everything is set up, I want to sit back and enjoy it. And part of that is choosing the right things for the right place at the right time, and that can make a huge difference. Sean is saying, aside from poor soil, my biggest challenge is weather. High winds, big hail, late early frost. Absolutely, Sean. Yeah, we have that issue here in Colorado, and so it's definitely a challenge. Now, one of my solutions is to cover big areas of my garden with hail cloth relatively permanently. It's there all season long so that I don't have to worry about the thunderstorms and the hail in those sections of my garden where I have all that hail cloth. I also build sturdy, strong structures. That's why I like my cattle panel hoops. They are so strong and sturdy, they're not blowing away in the wind and they're not collapsing in any unexpected snowfall that we get in May. It was, let's see, 28 years ago. Wow, can't believe it's been that long. So 28 years ago is when I moved to Colorado. And May of that year, we had a snowstorm. And as I remember, it was 15 inches of snow in May. That was a big lesson for me in the years since. You never know what's going to happen in the garden. So I build sturdy structures to overcome a lot of those obstacles, the wind and the hail and the snow. And I totally agree with you, Sean. That is one of the biggest challenges that I face in my garden. And it takes work, but once it's set up, all my hail cloth, all my hoops, all my structures, I don't worry about it at all. When I bought my greenhouse, I specifically did the research and looked for a greenhouse that could hold up to 60-mile-an-hour winds. And my greenhouse has held up to 75-mile-an-hour winds with absolutely no issue at all. If I had just taken the cheap approach and bought a cheap greenhouse, it would probably be somewhere in Nebraska right now because it would have disintegrated and blown away. So that's how I approached that challenge, was to break it down into the individual components in my garden and build it with that thought in mind, or modify it with that thought in mind. So I don't worry about the weather. I really don't. If I see a thunderstorm coming over, I might grab extra hailcloth. If it's extra hot, I might cover my plants with shade cloth for a couple weeks, but I don't worry about it because the structure is in place. And that's how I dealt with that challenge, is to take each day and deal with it if I need to deal with it at all. And that gets back to the working smarter and confronting the challenge at the basic level so that the problems really are minimal. Mobius is asking, my biggest challenge at the moment is removing snowberry bushes. Finally, they form a dense thicket and they spread underground. I clip them to the ground and am removing the waste, but tips. Yeah, this is one of those. And so snowberry is actually recommended here in Colorado as a plant to grow for wildlife in particular, because it doesn't spread very readily in our climate, particularly with our winters, and it's relatively easy to keep under control. The key is, and this holds true for a lot of these bushy plants, if you have a shrub or a bush that just keeps spreading, you got to stay on top of it. I mean, even my lilac bush spreads. Is that a bad thing? I mean, a lot of people want their lilac bush to spread until it gets too big, and then you have to deal with it. So all of these types of plants, these big woody plants that want to spread and take over, I start at the edges. And so as it starts to spread out and I see those new shoots pop up around the edges, those are the first ones to deal with. And if you want to keep the plant, that's often enough. Just keeping the edges pruned. You can, if you really want to get some hard work involved, and it can be very effective depending on the depth of the roots. Most of these plants have relatively shallow roots. So if you just take a spade or a shovel and cut all the way around the plant, a few feet away from the roots, to the depth of that shovel, then you will shear off most of those roots that have spread away from the plant. So that's a good way to begin keeping it under control. If you want to remove it completely, same basic idea. I think it's easier to start from the edges and work your way in, because a lot of times it's those young spreading roots that are going to pop into new plants. So if you see some of those shoots and don't necessarily cut them, go ahead and dig them out, and that will enable you to trace the roots back to the source, probably where the main bush is. By all means, try digging out those main bushes. But if you can track those individual roots from the periphery, from the outside in, then that will reduce the risk of it spreading further. A lot of work, a lot of digging, a lot of time, but that's the best way to really remove the bushes. It sounds like for you, they're more of a problem. And so the challenge is just trying to get all of the plants before they spread. Once you dig it all out, then stay on top of it. Look for those new bushes to start sprouting and get right on it. As soon as they appear in spring, dig them out. And eventually you're going to starve any roots that are left in the ground, and the bushes will be eradicated. And that holds true with any type of these plants. Takes time, but if you can remove, the roots that are left behind will have used up all of their energy to the point that they'll die. And then the plant is no longer an issue. So a lot of work, but you can definitely do it. Baby Root says, my biggest challenge is a short growing season. If I wait till my average last frost, I can't get heat-loving plants to maturity. So frustrating. Thanks for all of your insight. Yeah, that can be a big challenge. And it comes back to hoops. I think hoops over the beds, especially like I do where they're semi-permanent, they're in my beds all year round, extend your season on both ends. So the hoops I have over my vegetable garden now are roughly 2 feet high. But in my video where I show how to make hoops, I also have hoops that are closer to 3.5, and 4 feet high. That's the approach I take. Is I put the lower hoops over my beds in spring, like right now, to cover them with plastic to warm up the soil, to warm up the air around the plants, and that will enable you to plant earlier. And then you keep those plants protected. If cold nights threaten, we here in this part of Colorado, we can still have frost into June, but we want to get our plants in before then. You've got to cover them. You have to protect them. But then on the backside as well, when the plants are reaching maturity, you do the same thing. And so in my book, as a matter of fact, I actually show some pictures of it. And they're recent pictures. They're pictures I took last year on my pepper plants. And I did the same thing at the end of the season. My peppers were so close to maturity and frost was coming. So I covered that bed with plastic and the peppers survived and the fruit reached maturity and I had wonderful harvests. So hoops and plastic at the front side and the back side has worked best for me to overcome the issue with a short growing season. Yes, it's worked. But this is one of those where it's the smart way. So yeah, it can be hard setting up the hoops and putting the plastic in because you have to open up the plastic during the day so you don't overheat the plants. Then you have to close the plastic going into the night so you keep the plants warm. Yeah, there's work, but I don't consider that hard work. I consider that necessary work because that is something that can be very effective to lengthen your growing season. So give that a try, and hopefully that will actually work to your benefit in time. Okay, I know I'm well behind in the comments, so I'm going to scroll through. If there's something you really want me to see, do make sure you put at Gardner Scott, and that is more likely to get my attention as I'm scrolling through and trying to catch up. Liz G is asking, can moss be used for more than mulch in the garden? Got my hands on some mixed with seaweed. So yeah, absolutely. So depending on what kind of moss it is and depending on how wet your climate is, I've seen some beautiful gardens that actually use moss growing in the garden as a beautiful green area, like the green of any other type of plant we're growing, but that mossy green has its own distinct color and can really add some vibrancy and some attractiveness to the garden. So that's another way that you can use moss. If you're talking about the kind of moss that is used like in hanging baskets, same basic idea, but that's more of a dried moss. Do that. You've probably seen those semicircular hanging baskets that use moss at the bottom to hold in a small amount of soil, and then there are plants growing above it. Another great option that you could use the moss for. You can also add moss to your compost pile, whether it's green or brown. Use it as an ingredient in your compost pile. If you've got so much mulch that you don't know what to do with it, and especially if you mix it with the seaweed. Now, a lot of seaweeds can be very salty. So before I suggest using seaweed in the garden or seaweed in the mulch, I do suggest that you you soak it in water and drain off the water, try to get rid of any salt residue. But both the seaweed and the moss can be great additions to compost pile. A lot of nutrients, particularly in the seaweed, that will get into your compost. So there's a couple ideas, and I'd love to have access to seaweed and moss, but here in my dry Colorado, that just doesn't happen. But those can be really good things. If you've got a good source for it, I'd ask the people that are giving it to you and see how they use it, because that's another great way to learn how to use things in your garden, is to find out how others in your area are using it, and that might give you some ideas. Big Will Dog saying, I've had trouble with potted garlic not making it over winter. Would putting pots in my raised bed till spring help insulate them better, or bring into the cold garage? Either one. Yeah, a lot of the plants that we grow that do well in a raised bed or in the ground won't do well in pots. So for me, here in zone 5, I can't grow garlic very well, and I can't grow strawberries very well in pots. They do great when they're in my greater garden, but they just don't do well in the pots. The cold is just too extreme, and especially when things dry out, it can be very difficult. So burying those pots, kind of like we were talking about earlier, helps to moderate the temperature a little bit more. And so it makes it more likely for the garlic to survive the winter. And then once they start sprouting, sure, dig them up and move them to another area, and you've still got that bed space to grow something else in. It's just getting them through the winter and the severe cold that they might be exposed to if they're in pots outdoors. Bringing them into a protected area might be enough for that as well. So either of those would be good. And I would say experiment with both, just so you could see what you think is most successful. For me, having the protection is what works. I've got strawberries in my greenhouse right now because I've been able to keep my greenhouse at the equivalent of a zone 7 over the course of this winter. And so my strawberries in my green stock survived. But those same strawberries, not those same plants, but when I attempted to grow strawberries in that same green stock, but it was outside, none of the plants survived. So protection, getting that extra little bit of warmth is often enough to get you through the winter. And you know, when you put your garlic in this year, put some in pots in ground, and put some in pots, and then put them inside your garage, and do a little bit of analysis, which one had better success. And that will probably be the best answer to be able to figure out what you're going to do as you move forward. Okay, so nice to see all the discussions going on. Serena's saying, do you have a composite list of all the milkweed and other butterfly plants and which butterflies are attracted to them? I don't, but it's all over the internet. So yeah, you can just do a simple search for that. There's a lot of organizations. It's the Xerxes Society, I think it is, that does the butterflies, and they've got all kinds of lists like that could help you out with what butterfly plants to grow. I know a few, and I try to grow plants to attract lots of different butterflies, but knowing those specifics really does make a difference. So look up one of those butterfly societies, and they'll be able to give you the specific plants that match with the specific butterflies. And this matches again with what I was talking about, each of our individual gardens and our native plants that we're growing in our gardens. We have native insects. Those pests that you have are going to be different than the pests I have, because my native pests are going to be different than your native pests. It's the same with the butterflies. When it's a caterpillar, it's a pest. And there are different caterpillars that live in different regions all around the world. So knowing which caterpillars are native to your area will also help identify which butterflies and moths are native to your area, and vice versa. So learn what butterflies you have And then that will give you an idea of what the caterpillar is going to feed on, or what kind of plant the adult is going to lay eggs on. And then you can target your plants to match up with those particular butterflies and caterpillars in particular, because it can definitely make a difference. Many of the flowers we're growing are suitable for most pollinators, but if you really want to target a specific insect, that's the approach to take, is grow those specific plants, and you should notice much better success with those thoughts in mind. Bowtie Live, Dave's asking, I discovered American beauty berry in my garden last week. No clue where it came from, probably a bird. It is decorative and in a decent locale. Do you think I should keep it? It depends. I keep a lot of plants that pop up in my garden because I've got the space to keep those plants. And as long as they're popping up in an area where I don't mind a plant growing, then yeah, absolutely. I have some currant bushes that are, they're not necessarily native to my area, I think, but they grow everywhere. And I have had some of those pop up, and I leave them because they look good. They're a food source for birds in particular. And I like my garden filling up naturally because, and this may be one of the most important factors when you are trying to decide whether to keep a plant that just popped up. It just popped up. That means that soil, the conditions in that spot were good enough for that seed to germinate. Think about how many times we try to grow a plant and we can't get it to germinate. We can't get the seedling to grow. We transplant it. We can't get the plant to grow. And if something just pops up and is doing well, I am more willing to just let it go, because obviously nature is telling me that plant likes that spot. And I don't even have to work to make it happen. It just happens. So if you've got the space, and if it's a plant that you like, beautyberry can be a really nice bush. Let it go. At some point before it spreads, if you don't want it, you can always pull it out. But I like to give plants a chance if they're not interfering with other plants that I'm also trying to give a chance. Karen at A Garden for All Seasons says, so excited. I heard what you said last week about getting it faster than original orders. Just ordered it, getting it here tomorrow. Awesome. Talking about my book. I think that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. If you missed it last week, I was talking about how going to something like Amazon, for instance, for a lot of people was taking longer than when they ordered it earlier. And so going to it now, I just checked on it this weekend and it says 2-day shipping. So if you've had a delay finding the book, or were delaying in ordering the book, you can do it now. And it seems like the supply system has caught up with the demand. And so you can order it on whatever site that you get your books from, and you can expect that it's going to be here soon. So good for you. Gonna have it tomorrow. Let me know. And so appreciate some of you have started putting reviews of my book at different sites. Thank you so much for that. That really does help out. It's like on YouTube. If you give a thumbs up to this live stream, or if you give a thumbs up to any of my videos, YouTube is more likely to show that video or that live stream to somebody else. It works in the wholesale and retail world of books. If you give it a review, and even if it's not as good, I would love to have 5-star reviews. But if you give a 4-star review, or even a 3-star review, by you responding and filling out a review, then that makes that book more likely to be shown to somebody else. So would definitely appreciate the reviews for those of you that have the books. And it also gives me feedback. So I know if I do another book, some of the things to consider. So exciting for you, Karen. And Amira B. Sharp says, And Elmira from California, I got my book. Oh, cool. I look forward to using it to help my mom build her garden. Well, thank you for that idea. Yeah, that's exactly why I did the book, is to help people build a garden. Uh, with the focus, of course, being on raised beds, but there's so much in the book that is beyond just growing in raised beds. So helping your mother, good for you. I love that. I love anytime any of us are helping others start a garden. I mean, we love gardening, and if you can just spread that small amount of joy to somebody else, it's such a good feeling. Such a good feeling. LG Loya saying California here, zone 9B. We saw your videos on biochar. Cool. I have a 17 by 16 foot raised vegetable garden bed. How much biochar should we use? We bought a 15-pound bag. And so the thing about biochar is it's hard to use too much. It's easy to use too little, but some is better than none. And so the video that I have on my biochar, I talk about starting with a layer of the biochar. And the reason I I say that, I didn't really go into it much in that video, but it's to see how much the biochar you have will go. And so, especially in a 17 by 16 foot bed, that's almost what, 300 square feet of space. And so that 15-pound bag might not be enough to really fully incorporate well in that bed. So just spread a thin layer across the whole bed, and you'll probably be able to spread a quarter inch of biochar and then work that into the soil. That's enough to get started. If you spread that bag and you realize that it's pretty sparse, then either look at doing maybe just one half the bed, so you've got twice as much in that one half, and then get another bag later, or go ahead and spread it on the surface, work it into the soil, and then come back at another time in a couple months, next year, a couple years, and add a little bit more. The reason that I say you might not have enough is you have to imagine how biochar works. So biochar, the little pieces of carbon that are incorporated into the soil, if you put a quarter inch or even a half inch of the biochar on the surface of the soil, you want to work that into the soil to a depth of 6 or 8 inches. And so now imagine those particles that are being that deep in the soil, and they're going to be spread out quite a bit. That's okay. It doesn't have to be big clumps of biochar. You want it spread out, but you kind of have to envision the volume that you're talking about and how much of the biochar is actually getting down to the root level and benefiting the soil as a whole. So about a quarter to half an inch on the surface to start is what I often recommend. Work that in. It's going to do its magic in almost no time at all. And then over time, as you amend the bed with compost, you can add some more. And 2 applications. So ultimately, if you could have an inch of biochar on the surface that you incorporate throughout your soil down to a depth of about 8 inches, that should be suitable for anything that you're growing in. The problem is, especially with a bed that big, that's a lot of biochar. So use what you got and then think about maybe getting some more in the future. But even that amount is going to benefit the soil, and it will definitely improve it. And so getting started with it is the first step to actually having some of that healthy soil that the biochar can help out with. Okay. So much good stuff going on. Karen is asking, how high can temps get for garlic? Found some I didn't plant. Can I grow inside in Texas? And so it depends on the type of garlic. There's the soft neck varieties and there's the hard neck varieties. The soft neck varieties tend to do better in the hot regions, and the hard neck varieties tend to do better in cooler regions. And that holds true for both the summer and the winter. More importantly, is the winter, how well it can handle the cold. But the soft neck varieties, particularly like those that are growing in California, are suitable for the high temperature. When you start talking about Texas, Louisiana, now you want to start thinking about like Creole varieties of garlic, which take the soft neck varieties to a whole nother level. And those are the varieties of garlic that are specifically suitable for the hot temperatures that you might encounter in Texas. So it depends on the variety. It depends on what you found that you didn't plant. And so if it is a hardneck variety where it might be a little more affected by the heat, you can still grow it outside, but you might want to have shade cloth over it to help keep the intensity of the heat down. If it's one of those soft neck varieties that do well, like a Creole variety, you can grow it normally in Texas and probably not have any issues at all. So that's the first question to answer, is just what kind of variety you have, and can you grow it inside? Sure, absolutely. But realize that garlic takes a long time to grow, and it does like to have a lot of sun in the summer in particular. And so, do you have space inside to have this plant grow for a long time? And if you're growing it for the bulbs, it needs some cold exposure during the winter to be able to form that bulb. So you have to kind of plan that into the life cycle where that bulb is exposed to the cold, so or the clove is exposed to the cold and then turns into a bulb. And depending on how much time you have, it can all be done indoors. Put the bulb in your refrigerator for a couple months, then bring it out, plant the cloves, and you can do those in pots, and they should do fine and actually turn into garlic. But it takes time. Garlic's one of those things that 9 months from the time we put the clove in the ground to when we're harvesting is what's expected. Sometimes 10 months. It's easy to grow, but you have to have that dedicated spot for that entire time. And if you're doing it inside and outside, you're growing in pots and you're growing inside and outside, then there's some effort involved with that, of course. Dan's asking, last year's compost, grass and leaves, is not fully broken down. Lots of little leaf material. Should I just leave it till next year? I don't have room for a new compost. So it depends on why you were making compost. If you wanted to compost and as a soil amendment and you wanted it to be decomposed when you amended it, then I would say go ahead and revitalize the pile. If you've still got a pretty big pile of leafy material, you can put that boost of nitrogen, put some fresh grass clippings and get your pile heated back up again. That will speed the decomposition, and then you might be able to go ahead and use it this year. Something that I do a lot, because I do the lazy composting where it's a cool pile and it takes about a year for it to break down. I use that mostly as a mulch because it still has that leafy material in it. And so that's an option as well, to mulch your vegetable beds in particular with your chunky compost. It will continue to break down. And then at the end of the season, if you turn it into your soil, it will break down to essentially fully decomposed compost. All along, you got your other pile started. So if you can figure out a way to use it this year by either stimulating all the bacteria to decompose it faster by adding some nitrogen and oxygen and moisture, that's the one approach. Using it as a mulch is another approach. One of the things I did with my leaf mold is I got a big 55-gallon trash can, plastic, and my leaf mold that I showed in some videos a couple of years ago wasn't fully broken down. I just put that inside that trash can and it continued to break down. So now my leaf mold is just this really nice, fine, powdery leaf mold because it finished decomposing in that trash can. You can do the same thing with a regular compost to give you that space back to start a new pile. So a couple different things to consider. And those are all things that I've done on a regular basis, and actually works out pretty well. I don't like uh, the, it's not wasted space, but if I could be using that compost pile again as I get more materials, that's what I prefer to do. So even when my compost isn't ready to work into the soil, I still try to use it as much as possible. Riverdale Gardens, I saw that you were listening from work. So nice to see you here today. Your book showed up last Thursday. I love it so far. One of my biggest challenges over the years has been cabbage loper on the brassicas. BT and insect netting has done the trick. Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm glad you liked the book. Appreciate that. And so the cabbage insects, the BT, the insect netting, this is all that I was talking about earlier, where if it's one of those things, particularly an insect pest that comes from the outside in, the insect netting can make all the difference. If it's one of those insects that's eating the plant, then that's where the BT comes in, the Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacteria that comes in a powder form that you sprinkle on your plants. When the insect eats that leaf, it now ingests that bacteria and ends up killing the insect. So yeah, understanding the insect and its lifestyle is critical, and you obviously figured it out. So thank you for offering that, because that is one of those things, particularly on brassicas. When I first started growing broccoli years and years ago, before I knew a fraction of what I know now, I would grow the broccoli, harvest it. We would have it for dinner. I put it in a pot of boiling water, and all these little green caterpillars would float to the top. Well, my family no longer wanted to eat any of the broccoli because obviously it had all these little green caterpillars in it. But that's the kind of stuff we're talking about using BT for, because BT targets those caterpillars that are eating the brassicas, and it doesn't harm people. I mean, you're still going to wash your broccoli off before you eat it, but when you cook it, you're less likely to have all those little caterpillars wriggling to the surface of your pot. So uh, finding the things that make a difference are definitely the kind of things that we want to search for. And identifying the problem, identifying the challenge really does make a difference. Greg says, coming back to the biochar question, if you add an inch layer in year one, is it necessary to continue to add a similar amount every year, every other year? Oh, no. No, that's the nice thing about biochar, is it's essentially pure carbon. And so it doesn't decompose. It doesn't break down. And so if you can put an inch all at once, then you're done. You don't need to do it again. The only time you would consider doing the supplemental addition is if you didn't have a lot in the beginning, because it can be expensive and it can take a lot to amend your soil. And that's why I say do that over a period of years, just because it's more cost effective. But yeah, if you can put an inch in your beds all at once and get it worked well into that soil, you're done. You never need to do it again. If you are tilling your soils, and there's mixed discussion on this, by tilling your soil, you're going to break apart all those bits of biochar. Biochar still works when it's very, very small. We tend to see the bigger pieces when we spread it and work it into our soil. So even when you till it, you don't need another application. It's just much smaller, and the particles are distributed more evenly, and you can't even see it in the soil at that point. I like digging up my soil to put a plant in and seeing some biochar in the scoop. That tells me it's still there. I knew it would be, but I like seeing the little particles of biochar. But no, you don't need to worry about that, Greg. The idea is kind of aiming for an inch for depth in your garden bed, and that should be enough for as long as you have that garden bed. You don't need to keep doing it. That's one of the huge advantages to biochar is it doesn't break down, doesn't decompose. It keeps that structure within the soil, and it keeps the beneficial structure of the soil during the entire time that it's there. So, great option to have. Okay, I can't believe our time is just flying by. I just love Mondays and love talking about gardening. Of course, that should come as no surprise to you, but I love seeing everyone who's here and all the discussions that are going on. Yeah, Drew Black is exactly right. Biochar is often called forever compost because it, by itself, it does have some effect on the soil pH. It does have some impact on the nutrients, depending on what the biomass was that made the biochar. But it's primarily just a structure, and within that structure is all that wonderful soil bacteria and water and oxygen and nutrients. It's kind of a repository for all those good things in the soil, and it's always there. And so some of the biochar might actually be aerating your soil, adding some oxygen to it. Some of that biochar might actually be absorbing and holding on some of the moisture to help moderate the soil moisture within your bed. Some of that biochar is providing nutrients. Some of that biochar is like an incubator for the microbes within your soil. So lots of benefits and lots of things that it could be doing at the same time. So, for really good things to be thinking about when you have the biochar. Gina saying, my local biochar expert who works with Kelpie Wilson. So those of you who don't know, we had Kelpie on the show recently, and she is considered a biochar expert, wrote the book, says grinding your char to a near powder is best. Gives full access to microbes with all that surface area. Exactly. And the biggest issue I've seen people talk about is they think that when they grind it, like if they're doing a lot of tilling, so they're breaking the small pieces even into smaller pieces, is that they think they're eliminating it. Not at all. That's why I say you could still use it even if you're doing a lot of that tilling of the soil. And yeah, Kelpie, we talked a little bit about that in the show she was on, about the size of the particles. And so when you've got all that surface area, because we're talking microscopic level here, we talk microbes that are using the biochar, even those little powdery bits of carbon can still do all those wonderful things at the microscopic level for those microbes in the soil. So the thing about the powder personally is that, like I said, I like seeing the pieces. I just like knowing it's there. And as I work the soil over the years and as I transplant, if I come across a piece and I think, oh, that piece is a little too chunky, I break it into smaller pieces. Because a lot of the biochar I have in my bed, I've mentioned my friend who started a biochar business with the bones from his cattle ranch. And so I worked with him to develop a machine to pulverize the biochar. And I got a lot of those first samples as we were experimenting with different sizes. So I got a lot of really chunky biochar in my garden. And when I come across some of those pieces from some of those early batches, I break them into smaller pieces because the surface area really is important, and trying to get that surface area by having more pieces is really a good approach to take. So great way to think about it. More particles is better. That's kind of Kelpie's approach to it. But ultimately, it comes down to how much you have and how much you can use. The bigger pieces, I think, are a little bit easier to incorporate, again, because you can see them and you can get a feel for how much is at the 8-inch deep, 6-inch deep, 2-inch deep. And that's why I like seeing it. So I can see that it's been incorporated. When it's really powdery, hopefully it gets well incorporated, but I like seeing it. Outlier Garden, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you for another wonderful live. You are so welcome. It's so nice to see you here. all these weeks. And thank you so much for supporting the channel. I do appreciate it. And of course, I thank all of you for another wonderful live. I just love doing this and being able to see all the stuff you're talking about. Shandy's Garden says, I'm still confused about how much ash can be added to the beds. I know it's potassium, but can you overdo it? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm working on a video now that I probably won't release till summer. I'm putting together the foundation and the framework of the video. But one of the things I talk about, or will be talking about, is wood ash. And the video is going to be about the tips that are bad, and wood ash is one of those, because you can use too much. And I'll give you a heads up because I'll be talking about this in the video as well. So you hear about Epsom salts being good for the garden. Well, Epsom salts are magnesium sulfate, and plants need magnesium and they need sulfur. If you've got too much potassium in your soil, it actually locks out a lot of these other nutrients, like magnesium. So magnesium sulfate might be good if your soil is deficient in magnesium, and very few of our soils are, but that's another point that I'll be raising in that video. But if you've got too much potassium in your soil, you can add all the magnesium you want, and it's going to be locked out. The plant can't absorb it because the potassium is just overwhelming the plant and not letting these other nutrients in. So that's kind of the extreme where too much potassium can really cause your plants to suffer. That's one of the things. The other issue that many of us have is that the ash actually raises the soil pH. So if you have a naturally alkaline soil, and my region of Colorado tends to be alkaline, by adding ash, you actually raise the pH. And now you have the same kind of issue. Plants need to operate within a very specific range of pH, generally around 6.5. If you can keep your pH in that general range, 6.5 to 7 for a lot of the plants we're growing, they'll do great. But if you start getting too much above 7.0 pH, your plants aren't going to do well. They're going to suffer. And it could be because you are adding too much wood ash. So here in Colorado, the Extension Service, the master gardeners are taught, do not recommend wood ash in Colorado because the soil is alkaline. Those pH issues in particular can make gardens unsuccessful. So that's the question I posed back to you. What's your soil pH? If you've got acidic soil, it's not a big issue. And so much of this information we get about adding wood ash comes from the east and the south of the United States, areas that have been growing for centuries now. The first people that were writing gardening books, a lot of that soil is quite acidic. And so when you add ash to soil that is already acidic, you're actually raising it into that moderate range, into that good range for plants. So it makes perfect sense to add wood ash to soils like that. Do you have soil like that? If your soil is already neutral or alkaline, then I would probably say you don't need to be adding wood ash. If you've got acidic soil, add wood ash, take some samples and have it tested. And when you get into the good range, then stop adding wood ash. The potassium component is only good to a point, and you can overdo it. That's where the soil test comes in, is figuring out the pH and figuring out how much potassium you have. And you may not need to add any wood ash at all, other than you feel guilty because so many people tell you it's a wonderful thing. It's not. Wood ash is free. It's easy to use, but it's not appropriate for everybody. And that's really the key factor. Mindful Inventor says plants can influence the pH in the rhizosphere, though. No. Yes, you're right. To a degree, at least. So most plants can even handle slightly higher than ideal pH. Yeah, and that's why there's a range. And so you're right. The rhizosphere, they're in the soil and we're learning so much more about this. The roots, actually, I read this an article recently, some research that I thought was just fascinating, that now puts the roots of a plant as one of the primary ways to improve your soil. That we've always looked at adding these external things to our soil, the organic matter, the compost in particular, and that is definitely true. But that the exudates, what the roots are actually exuding into the soil, improves the structure, it improves the nutrient balance, it improves the pH. And so it all tends to buffer, but within a range. And so when you look at one of those charts that shows the plants for the ranges that they prefer, the idea is that yes, or I should say, the newer understanding is that the plant is affecting that pH to enable it to grow well within that range. When you start getting to the edge of that range and beyond, then it's going to be a problem. Blueberries are a perfect example of that, where they like an acidic soil range around 3.5 pH tends to be a good focus when you're trying to get a blueberry soil. But if you're trying to grow blueberries in a 7.0 pH soil, the plant might survive. It's probably going to suffer. You're probably never going to see fruit on that plant. And it's because it's just too far outside the range for that particular plant. And that holds true with most of the plants we grow in our garden. Some of the ranges can be quite wide, but some can also be quite narrow. And that's a key, is understanding all of that. So Jay says, love all the questions, but we are out of time today. And Jay is headed off to an appointment. Hope everything goes well. Jay, you are in our thoughts as well. Thanks, folks, to all of you, to Jay and Heidi, our regular helpers on the channel. They're more than moderators. They really help keep the channel going. Thank you as well. And all of you who participate and are supportive. I'm headed outside because the weather is good. Weather's going to be great this week. I hope it's good for you. I hope you can get out there whenever you get out in the garden. Of course, you know it. Enjoy gardening. I'll see you next Monday.